The desert wind howled across the plains of Black Mesa territory, carrying dust, secrets, and old blood with it. Few dared to travel this land anymore. It was cursed, people said. Towns rose and died here like dying fires. But on one burning afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. His name was Jonah Creed. Jonah rode a tired black horse, its ribs showing beneath its skin. His coat was faded, his hat pulled low, and a revolver rested at his side like an old friend. There was something different about him, something calm, dangerous. Men who had survived gunfights often carried a look in their eyes. Jonah carried silence. Ahead lay Dry Creek, a town barely hanging on. Wooden buildings leaned like old men, and the saloon doors creaked though no wind touched them. Dry Creek was ruled by fear of one man. Silas Boone. Boone was more than an outlaw. He controlled the water wells, the cattle routes, and even the sheriff. Anyone who crossed him disappeared into the desert. Mothers warned their sons never to speak his name after dark. When Jonah rode into town, heads turned. Conversations died. The piano stopped mid-note. Jonah dismounted slowly and tied his horse outside the saloon. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey and regret. Jonah ordered water instead of alcohol, which earned him strange looks. He scanned the room, his eyes stopping on a young boy cleaning glasses behind the counter. The boy's hands trembled. "Who runs this town?" Jonah asked quietly. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Silas Boone, sir." Jonah nodded once. That name had brought him here. Years ago, Jonah had owned a ranch just outside Dry Creek. Boone and his men had taken it by force, burned it to the ground and killed Jonah's brother when he refused to leave. Jonah had been shot and left for dead in the sand. But death had not wanted him. The saloon doors swung open. Boone's men entered, 4 of them, guns visible, smiles cruel. One stepped forward. "Stranger," he sneered, "you best leave town before sunset." Jonah stood slowly. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I already left once," he said. "This time, I'm here to stay." The room froze. Hands moved. Guns cleared leather. 3 shots rang out like thunder. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay bleeding on the floor. The 4th ran screaming into the street. Jonah holstered his gun and walked outside as if nothing had happened. From the shadows of Dry Creek, fear shifted. And a legend began to wake. By nightfall, the whole of Dry Creek knew one thing: Jonah Creed was back. The bodies in the saloon were carried out and buried without prayers, but their bloodstains remained on the wooden floor like dark warnings. No one dared to clean them. It was as if the town wanted Silas Boone to see what had happened. Boone saw it before sunrise. From the balcony of his ranch house on the hill, Silas Boone watched Dry Creek through a spyglass. He was a tall man with silver-threaded hair and cold blue eyes. Power had shaped him into something hard and cruel. When his rider returned with fear in his voice and Jonah Creed's name on his lips, Boone's jaw tightened. "So," Boone said softly, "the dead man walks." Boone remembered Jonah well. He remembered the stubborn rancher who refused to sell his land, the brother who had reached for a rifle too slowly, and the way Jonah had crawled into the desert, bleeding and broken. Boone had assumed the desert finished the job. He had been wrong. Boone summoned his lieutenants, Harlan Pike, a knife-happy killer, and Tom Rourke, a massive gunman with a scarred face. The plan was simple: crush Jonah Creed quickly and publicly. "Make it ugly," Boone ordered. "I want Dry Creek reminded who owns it." Meanwhile, Jonah spent the night in the old livery stable, sleeping lightly with his gun. Beside him, memories came in fragments: fire, screams, his brother's last breath. He woke before dawn and stepped outside. The town was quiet, but the quiet felt tense, like a held breath. As Jonah walked the main street, doors cracked open. People watched him with fear and something else: hope. An old woman pressed a piece of bread into his hand without a word. A shopkeeper nodded once, respectfully. At the edge of town, Jonah found something that made his chest tighten. The remains of his ranch. Blackened posts stuck out of the earth like broken bones. Jonah knelt, running his fingers through the dust. "I'm back," he whispered. A gunshot shattered the moment. Bullets kicked dirt around Jonah as Boone's men opened fire from the ridge. Jonah rolled behind a fallen beam and returned fire with deadly precision. 2 men fell before they knew what hit them. Harlan Pike rushed forward with a knife, screaming. Jonah fired once. Pike dropped face first into the dirt. Tom Rourke hesitated. For the first time in years, fear crossed his brutal face. He turned and ran. Jonah stood alone among the dead, smoke drifting in the morning air. He knew Boone wouldn't stop now. This was no longer about land. It was about control and revenge. High on the hill, Silas Boone lowered his spyglass. "Bring me his head," he growled. "This town will burn before I lose it." The war for Dry Creek had begun. Dry Creek changed after the Sunrise gunfight. Fear no longer sat quietly in corners, it walked openly through the streets. Windows stayed shut, shops closed early. Everyone knew Silas Boone would answer violence with worse violence, and Jonah Creed was now the center of it all. By noon, Boone made his move. A wagon rolled slowly into town, pulled by 2 tired horses. Inside sat Sheriff Elroy Maddox, his hands tied, his face bruised and swollen. The wagon stopped in the middle of Main Street. Boone's men forced the sheriff down and tied him to the hitching post outside the saloon. A message was clear: this is what happens to those who lose control. Word reached Jonah within minutes. He was at the livery, cleaning his revolver, when the frightened boy from the saloon came running. "They got the sheriff," the boy gasped. "They say they'll kill him if you don't show yourself." Jonah closed the cylinder of his gun with a soft click. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened. "Stay inside," Jonah said. "No matter what happens." Jonah walked down Main Street alone. Each step echoed. Boone's men lined the rooftops and porches, rifles ready. Townsfolk watched from behind doors, holding their breath. Sheriff Maddox lifted his head when he saw Jonah. "Creed," he croaked, "don't do this." Jonah stopped 10 feet away. "This ain't your fight," Maddox said. Jonah met the sheriff's eyes. "It's always been my fight." A voice rang out from the balcony of the saloon. Silas Boone stepped forward, smiling coldly. "You've caused enough trouble, Jonah. Lay down your gun, and I might let these people live." Jonah glanced around. Innocent faces. Fear. Children hiding behind their mothers. Slowly, Jonah raised his revolver, then let it fall into the dust. Boone laughed. "Smart choice." That was when the first shot rang out. A Boone gunman fired too early. The bullet tore into the rope holding the sheriff. Chaos exploded. Jonah dove forward, grabbed his fallen revolver, and the street became a storm of gunfire. Jonah moved like a man possessed. He fired from cover, never wasting a bullet. One by one, Boone's men fell from rooftops and porches. Screams echoed. Glass shattered. Sheriff Maddox crawled to safety. When the smoke cleared, Main Street was littered with bodies. Boone had escaped. Jonah stood in the center of the destruction, breathing hard. His coat was torn, blood ran down his arm, but he was still standing. The townspeople slowly emerged. For the first time in years, they looked at Boone's men lying dead and felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Sheriff Maddox approached Jonah. "You saved this town." Jonah shook his head. "Not yet." He looked toward Boone's ranch on the hill, dark against the sky. "This ends with Silas Boone," Jonah said. "And it ends soon." High above Dry Creek, Boone watched the carnage with fury burning in his eyes. "This ain't over," he whispered. "It's just getting bloody." The sun had barely risen over Black Mesa when Jonah Creed saddled his horse. Dry Creek was quiet now, but silence never lasted long in the Wild West. Silas Boone had retreated to his ranch on the hill, but Jonah knew better than to assume Boone would wait passively. He was a cunning man, and vengeance burned in his veins. Jonah rode east toward Red Canyon, a twisting labyrinth of cliffs and jagged rock formations. Boone's men often used it to ambush travelers and hide stolen goods. Jonah had studied the terrain for days. Every twist, every crevice, every shadow was a map in his mind. He intended to turn Boone's own tricks against him. As Jonah entered the canyon, the distant sound of hooves echoed off the cliffs. Boone's men were approaching from the far side, their horses kicking up dust in the morning sun. Jonah dismounted and tied his horse behind a boulder, moving silently along the rocky ledge. He knew the first volley would be crucial. The Boone gang emerged, 6 strong, rifles ready, eyes scanning for the lone rider they expected to be easy prey. Jonah waited. When they reached the narrowest part of the canyon, he struck. A shot rang out. A horse reared, throwing its rider into the rocks. Jonah fired again, hitting a second man as he tried to run. The gang was in chaos. Rocks and dust swirled as Jonah used the canyon's natural cover to his advantage. Each move was calculated, precise, like a deadly dance he had practiced his entire life. One of Boone's men tried to flank him through a side path. Jonah anticipated it, stepping out of the shadows and ending the threat with one clean shot. The others began to retreat, confusion and fear overtaking their confidence. Jonah's reputation had grown even faster than he realized. Stories of his skill traveled ahead of him. As the dust settled, Jonah paused to catch his breath. The canyon was littered with injured men and toppled horses. Only 3 of Boone's gang remained conscious, hiding behind boulders. Jonah stepped forward slowly, gun leveled, his eyes cold as stone. "Tell Boone," Jonah said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, "his time is up. The next fight is his last." The surviving men scrambled away, leaving Jonah alone in the canyon. He walked over to a wounded rider, checking him for life signs. The man groaned but was alive. Jonah left him with water and directions to return to Boone. He wanted Boone to feel the weight of defeat, not mercy. Jonah mounted his horse and looked out across Red Canyon, the sun painting the cliffs red. Every shadow seemed to whisper the coming storm. Boone would retaliate, of that Jonah was certain. But for the first time in years, he felt the power of control returning to his hands. Dry Creek would no longer bow to fear. As he rode back toward the town, the wind carried the distant sound of hooves again. Boone was on the move. The final confrontation was drawing near, and Jonah knew there would be no second chances. Black Mesa was about to witness a battle that would be remembered for decades. By late afternoon, Jonah Creed rode silently through the dry plains toward Boone's hilltop ranch. The sun glared red against the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. From this distance, the ranch looked like a fortress. Wooden walls stretched high, and Boone's men patrolled the perimeter with rifles in hand. Every tower, every barricade was a testament to Boone's obsession with control, and his fear of Jonah. Jonah dismounted at the edge of a small creek that cut through the plains. Water ran cold, and the wind carried a faint scent of smoke from previous skirmishes. He checked his revolvers, loading them with deliberate calm, then crouched low, scanning the land. He needed a plan. One rash move and Boone would crush him. Inside the ranch, Silas Boone paced. His men had returned from Red Canyon battered and beaten, their morale shattered. Boone slammed a fist against the wall. "Creed's becoming a problem I can't ignore. Gather the men. Tonight, we end him, once and for all." The gates slammed open, and Boone's men lined the perimeter. They knew their leader's reputation and the price of failure. Horses neighed, guns clicked, and the ranch echoed with tension. Jonah watched as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching like fingers. He mounted a small rise, studying the terrain. Using the hills and the sparse brush for cover, he approached silently. Every step was measured, every movement hidden. Boone's men were confident, but overconfidence was a weakness Jonah had long learned to exploit. He began the attack at dusk. A shot rang from the ridge, striking the nearest guard. Panic erupted. Jonah moved like lightning from cover to cover, taking down guards with precision. Horses bolted, kicking dirt and creating chaos. Boone shouted orders, but the noise of the attack drowned out command. His men scattered, unsure where the bullets were coming from. Jonah didn't aim to kill all of Boone's men, just enough to weaken their defense. He used fire, setting small brush patches ablaze to cut off escape routes and create confusion. Smoke billowed across the ranch, painting the night sky red. From the shadows, Jonah emerged like a ghost, striking again and disappearing before anyone could aim properly. Boone finally appeared at the balcony, rifle in hand. His eyes met Jonah's across the chaos. "You think this ends with you?" he yelled. "You'll burn here." Jonah's gaze was steady. "It ends with you," he replied. And he moved. The final push was brutal. Boone's men fought desperately, but Jonah's strategy and skill overwhelmed them. Step by step, the perimeter collapsed. Guards fell, barricades were broken, and the night grew alive with shouts and gunfire. Finally, Jonah reached the central yard. Boone stood there, defiant but cornered. His rifle trembled in his hands. Jonah leveled his revolver. Boone's eyes widened, fear replacing arrogance. The lawless reign of Silas Boone was ending tonight. "Give up," Jonah said calmly. "It's over." Boone laughed bitterly, raising his gun. But it was too late. Jonah's shot rang true, knocking the weapon from Boone's hand. The tyrant of Dry Creek was defeated, and his fortress had fallen. Jonah stood in the moonlit yard, exhausted, breathing hard. Around him, the ranch lay in ruins, but a strange peace settled in the air. Dry Creek was free, for now. But Jonah knew one thing. In the Wild West, legends never truly die. The first light of dawn broke over Dry Creek, casting a pale glow on the ruins of Boone's ranch. Jonah Creed had spent the night securing the property, tying up the few surviving men and ensuring no one could rally back. For the first time in years, the town below slept without fear. But Jonah knew the peace was temporary. In the Wild West, old grudges and bitter men never stayed buried for long. Jonah rode back toward Dry Creek, the wind carrying the scent of scorched wood and dust. His horse trotted steadily, each hoofbeat echoing against the canyon walls. Townsfolk peeked from behind doors and windows, relief and curiosity mingling in their eyes. Jonah's legend had grown overnight, and whispers of the man who bested Silas Boone spread faster than wildfire. At the edge of town, a small group of women and children gathered near the old general store. Among them was Mary Dawson, the schoolteacher who had aided Jonah in secret. She held a basket of food, but her eyes were fixed on him, searching for any sign of injury. Jonah smiled faintly, adjusting his hat. "Rest easy," he said. "Boone won't trouble you anymore." Mary hesitated. "And what about his men? Won't they come for revenge?" Jonah dismounted, tying his horse to a post. "If they do, they'll learn what happens when you bring darkness to this land." His voice was calm but carried the weight of someone who had stared death in the face and survived. Just as Jonah was about to move on, a distant shout rose from the plains. Horses thundered in the distance. Jonah's instincts sharpened. He leapt onto a rock and scanned the horizon. Smoke curled from the hills, a signal fire. Boone's loyal men were gathering, planning to strike while he was distracted. Jonah didn't panic. He had learned the value of patience. From the rocks above the town, he observed their movements. They were skilled riders, but disorganized and fueled by desperation rather than strategy. Jonah smiled grimly. They would not have the advantage of fear this time. He slid down the slope, gathering a few willing townsfolk who were brave enough to help. Together, they set traps along the expected route of the riders: loose rocks, spiked branches, and hidden pits. Jonah positioned himself at the highest point, his revolvers ready. This would be the proving ground of his legend. As the gang approached, the traps worked immediately. Horses stumbled, men fell, and chaos erupted. Jonah picked them off one by one, firing with deadly accuracy. The plains became a theater of dust and gunfire, every shot echoing through the canyons. By mid-morning, the threat was neutralized. Only a few survivors fled into the distance, carrying the story of Jonah Creed's vengeance. Jonah returned to Dry Creek, bloodied but alive. The town began to rebuild, and the air felt lighter for the first time in decades. Children played freely in the streets, women worked openly, and the town had reclaimed a sense of normalcy. Jonah knew, however, that legends were not measured by peace, but by the battles they survived. He looked toward the ridge where Boone once ruled, now silent and empty. "Rest easy," Jonah whispered to the wind, "for the West remembers." The shadow of revenge had passed, but the name Jonah Creed would echo forever. Weeks had passed since Jonah Creed's victory over Silas Boone. Dry Creek was slowly returning to life. Stores reopened, the saloon played music once again, and the townsfolk moved through the streets without looking over their shoulders. But Jonah knew better than to trust the calm. In the Wild West, danger rarely rested, and old enemies often hid in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jonah rode out early one morning to check the outskirts of the town. His horse kicked up dust along the trail as he scanned the horizon. The land seemed peaceful, but his sharp eyes caught a subtle movement among the distant hills, a flicker of smoke, a shadow of men moving through the scrub. Boone's surviving gang had not forgotten. They had fled after the Red Canyon ambush, but now they were gathering allies from nearby towns, plotting a way to regain power. Jonah dismounted and crouched behind a rocky outcrop, his revolvers ready. He counted 8 riders approaching, carrying rifles and revolvers, each one skilled in the deadly art of frontier combat. He did not act immediately. Instead, Jonah observed, analyzing their formation and behavior. He noticed a young rider lagging behind, nervous and inexperienced, clearly less committed than the others. Jonah's lips curved into a faint smile. Fear was a weapon, and he would use it. He crept along the rocks, positioning himself for a surprise strike. As the gang reached a narrow pass, Jonah fired a single shot that rang out like thunder. The bullet struck a boulder near the lead rider, throwing the group into panic. Dust and debris flew into the air as horses reared and men shouted. Jonah moved with practiced precision, picking off riders one by one. His shots were deliberate, his aim deadly. The inexperienced rider fled, abandoning his comrades. The others tried to regroup, but the terrain was Jonah's ally. The rocky hills, hidden gullies, and scattered boulders allowed him to strike and vanish, keeping the gang off balance. By mid-morning, the attack was over. 3 riders lay injured, 2 escaped with their lives, and the rest had surrendered. Jonah approached them cautiously, keeping his revolvers trained. "Tell Boone," he said, "the West doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And it certainly doesn't welcome tyrants back." The survivors nodded, terrified, and rode away, carrying Jonah's warning. The threat was temporarily silenced, but he knew Boone's cunning could never be underestimated. Returning to Dry Creek, Jonah found Mary Dawson waiting by the creek, holding a basket of fresh bread. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Jonah nodded, though his eyes remained distant. "For now," he said. "But men like Boone leave shadows long after they're gone. The West is full of them." Mary shivered at his words, realizing that Jonah's fight for justice was far from over. Yet, despite the danger, there was a sense of hope in the town. Jonah Creed was alive, and he was watching. The people of Dry Creek would sleep easier for a while, but the legend of Jonah Creed, and the shadow of Silas Boone, would continue to grow, carried by the wind across the plains and canyons of the Wild West. For the first time in weeks, Dry Creek slept without the constant fear of Boone's men. The town slowly returned to life. Children ran through dusty streets, women tended gardens, and the saloon's piano rang with cheerful notes. But Jonah Creed knew better than to believe the quiet meant safety. In the Wild West, silence was often the loudest warning of what was coming. Jonah rode out early, alone, along the ridge overlooking the plains. The horizon glowed with the soft pink of sunrise, but Jonah's eyes were trained on the land, alert for any sign of movement. He scanned the hills, canyons, and hidden trails, knowing Boone's cunning could strike from anywhere. Mary Dawson approached quietly, carrying a basket of provisions. "Jonah," she said softly, "you can't watch over this town forever." Jonah turned, his eyes shadowed with determination. "I don't plan to. But I can make sure the first strike is mine." Mary sighed, glancing at the distant horizon. "And the people, the children, they'll be safe," Jonah said firmly. "If Boone wants war, he'll have to go through me first." Back in the hills, Silas Boone had been gathering allies. Weeks of hiding and plotting had hardened his resolve. He had lost men, land, and reputation, but one thing remained: his hatred for Jonah Creed. Boone surveyed the town from a rocky overlook, the sun glinting off his rifle. "Creed thinks this ends with him in charge," he muttered. "I'll show him the West belongs to me." Jonah returned to Dry Creek that afternoon to warn the townspeople. He gathered a small group of able men and women willing to defend their home. They reinforced barricades, hid weapons in clever spots, and set traps along the main roads. Jonah taught them basic rifle and pistol techniques, transforming ordinary townsfolk into a defensive force. As night fell, the town glowed softly under lantern light, and Jonah sat atop the ridge, scanning the distant horizon. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a possible threat. Hours passed. The town was quiet, but Jonah remained vigilant. He cleaned his revolvers again and checked the traps, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Boone's attack could come at any moment. Suddenly, a distant flash of movement caught his eye. A rider, silhouetted against the moonlight, moved swiftly toward the town. Jonah's heart tightened. Boone was coming. He called quietly to the townsfolk, positioning them at strategic points. The traps were ready, the barricades set, and Jonah himself was poised to strike from the shadows. This was the calm before the storm, the last moment of peace before the battle that would decide the fate of Dry Creek. Jonah's jaw tightened as he scanned the horizon again. The legend of the Wild West was about to witness another chapter in the war between justice and tyranny. And Jonah Creed would be at the center of it all. The wind whispered through the ridges. It carried one message: the showdown was coming, and only one would walk away. Night had fallen over Dry Creek, and the town lay bathed in the silver light of a full moon. Jonah Creed crouched atop the ridge, his eyes sharp, hands steady on his revolvers. The wind carried the faint sound of hooves, growing louder with each heartbeat. Boone had arrived with his remaining men, and the final battle for the town was about to begin. Jonah signaled to the townsfolk who had bravely taken positions along the barricades and behind buildings. Women and men, armed with rifles and shotguns, gripped their weapons tightly. Children were safely hidden, and the town's future rested in the hands of the few willing to fight. Jonah's calm presence gave them courage, his reputation inspiring hope where fear had once ruled. From the hills above, Jonah could see Boone's men forming a semicircle, attempting to surround Dry Creek. Boone rode at their center, tall and imposing, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the town, looking for signs of Jonah. The two men locked eyes across the distance, each recognizing the other as the only obstacle standing between victory and ruin. The first shots rang out from Boone's flank, and the battle erupted in a storm of gunfire. Dust and smoke swirled through the streets as Jonah picked his targets with deadly precision. He moved from rock to rock, firing without hesitation. One of Boone's men went down with a scream, another dropped behind a toppled cart. The town echoed with chaos and the cries of the desperate. Boone, furious, rode closer to the town's center, shouting orders. "Kill him! Kill Creed!" His men responded, but Jonah had prepared well. Traps slowed their advance, fallen logs, hidden pits, and sharpened stakes caused chaos among the riders. Panic spread quickly. Boone's control over his men slipped, and the calculated fury of the past weeks turned to disorder. Jonah fired from a higher ridge, using his superior position to pick off Boone's riders. One by one, they fell. The townsfolk, now emboldened, joined the fight. Women took aim from behind barricades, and farmers, armed with rifles, moved through the streets with precision. The legend of Jonah Creed had inspired them to fight as one. Finally, only Boone remained. He stood atop a cart in the town square, rifle raised. "You think you've won," he shouted, his voice raw with rage. Jonah stepped into the open street, revolvers drawn, every movement deliberate and unshakable. "You know I don't fight for victory," Jonah said calmly. "I fight for justice." The two men exchanged fire across the square. Boone's rifle cracked, but Jonah's aim was quicker. A single shot disarmed Boone, sending his weapon clattering into the dust. The tyrant's eyes widened in disbelief. Jonah advanced slowly, revolvers trained, and Boone finally dropped to his knees. The battle for Dry Creek was over. Boone's reign of terror had ended, and the town stood free for the first time in decades. Jonah lowered his guns, breathing hard. Around him, the townsfolk emerged cautiously from hiding, relief washing over their faces. The streets were filled with the sound of laughter, tears, and gratitude. But Jonah knew the West was never truly safe. Legends never rest, and the shadow of the frontier always lingered. The first light of dawn spilled over Dry Creek, painting the town in warm gold. The battle was over, and the streets were silent except for the occasional creak of a door or the soft neighing of horses. Jonah Creed stood in the center of the square, his hat low, his revolvers holstered. Dust clung to his coat, and small cuts marked his hands and face, but he was alive. More importantly, the town was free. Silas Boone had been captured, tied to a post in the town square. The tyrant who had ruled with fear now sat in defeat, glaring at Jonah with eyes full of hatred. He had underestimated the man who had survived the desert, the ambushes, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Boone's era of terror had ended, and Jonah had ensured it would never return. The townsfolk gathered around cautiously. Faces were streaked with dirt and tears, but their expressions held awe and relief. Mary Dawson stepped forward, placing a hand on Jonah's arm. "You've saved us all," she whispered. Jonah nodded, but his eyes scanned the horizon. "This isn't just about today," he said. "It's about making sure the West remembers what justice looks like. Tyrants can rise, but they fall when people refuse to bow." Children peeked out from behind carts, wide-eyed. Farmers, shopkeepers, and women all nodded silently. They had witnessed courage, precision, and a relentless determination that could only belong to a legend. Jonah had taught them to fight, yes, but more importantly, he had shown them the value of hope in a land that often forgot it. Jonah turned his attention back to Boone. "You'll answer for your crimes," he said quietly. Boone spat in the dust but said nothing. Jonah signaled to Sheriff Maddox, who stepped forward to take Boone into custody. The law would handle him now. Justice, not vengeance, would close this chapter. The town began to rebuild immediately. Blackened buildings were repaired, fences replaced, and water wells cleaned. For the first time in decades, Dry Creek could breathe. Jonah walked slowly through the streets, nodding to those who had survived the terror. Every face told a story of resilience, and every gesture whispered thanks. By midday, Jonah stood at the edge of town, overlooking the plains. His horse grazed quietly nearby. He knew he could not stay. The West was vast, and injustice existed in countless forms. There were more towns to protect, more legends to live. Jonah's journey was not over, it never truly ended. Legends never rest. Mary approached once more. "Will you come back?" she asked softly. Jonah smiled faintly. "The West has a way of bringing people together again. But for now, this town is safe. That's enough." With that, he swung onto his horse and rode toward the horizon. Dust rose behind him, swirling in the morning light. As he disappeared into the plains, the people of Dry Creek watched silently. Stories would be told of Jonah Creed for generations, the man who returned to claim justice, who fought Boone, and who reminded a town that courage and determination could stand against fear. In the Wild West, names faded quickly, but legends endure forever. The wind whispered through the plains, carrying the tale far and wide. Jonah Creed had walked these lands, and the West would never forget him.